The rope burn around my wrists had barely healed when they told me my punishment. I was to guard the daughter of the man who destroyed my life. What they didn't tell me was that she was the most dangerous person I'd ever meet, not because of any weapon she carried, but because of what she would make me feel. My name is Garrett Whitmore, though that name carries little weight now. At 29, should have been managing my ancestral estates, attending Parliament, living the life I was born to inherit. Instead, I stood in the courtyard of what had once been my family's manor, watching servants scurry about under the authority of another man, a man who wore my father's signet ring as if it had always belonged to him. The autumn storm was building overhead, dark clouds rolling across the Yorkshire moors like an omen of the humiliation to come. 6 months ago, I had been Lord Whitmore, Earl of Bramfield, master of these very stones. Now I was nothing more than a disgraced guardsman, stripped of title and fortune by accusations I couldn't prove false, no matter how desperately I tried. The accusations had been precise, calculated, devastating. Theft of crown funds. Conspiracy against the realm. Treason. Each charge more damning than the last, each piece of evidence more perfectly placed than any honest mistake could account for. But perfection, I had learned too late, was often the signature of a lie well crafted. Lord Edmund Ashford emerged from the great hall, his footsteps echoing against the stones that had once echoed with my own. He was a man of middling height but commanding presence, his dark hair streaked with silver, his eyes sharp with the intelligence that had somehow outmaneuvered my family's centuries of careful stewardship. He wore my father's coat of arms now, had married into the Whitmore bloodline through a distant cousin's desperate need for financial rescue, and had positioned himself perfectly to catch my falling fortune when the accusations came. He looked at me with something that might have been pity, if I hadn't known better. There was satisfaction in his gaze, the quiet pleasure of a man whose long-laid plans had finally come to fruition. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that should have been mine. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, emphasizing the common address where once he would have bowed to my title. "I trust your accommodations in London were educational." The Tower had been many things, but educational wasn't the word I would have chosen. The cold stone walls, the constant dampness, the way hope slowly leaked from a man's soul like water through limestone cracks. I had learned things there, certainly. I had learned that justice was a luxury the innocent couldn't always afford, and that revenge was a dish that grew colder with each passing day until it became something else entirely. "Quite," I replied, keeping my voice level. Pride was all I had left, and I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing it broken. He gestured toward the manor, its Georgian columns and perfectly maintained gardens a testament to wealth that had once been mine. "You understand the terms of your release, of course. Service to my household for a period of no less than 2 years, in whatever capacity I deem appropriate. Full supervision, naturally. Any attempt to leave the estate grounds without explicit permission will result in your immediate return to custody." I understood perfectly. I was to be a living reminder of his victory, a former lord reduced to servitude in his own ancestral home. It was a punishment more creative and cruel than simple imprisonment, a daily humiliation that would serve as both entertainment and warning to others who might question his rise to power. And my specific duties? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be designed to maximize my degradation. His smile was thin, practiced. "You are to serve as personal guard to my daughter. Miss Lydia Ashford requires protection during her daily activities, companionship during her rides, supervision during her social engagements. You will ensure her safety at all times, answer to her every reasonable request, and report any concerns directly to me." The irony was perfect, I had to admit. The man who had stolen my title now commanded me to protect what was most precious to him. It was the kind of twisted justice that powerful men enjoyed inflicting, forcing their enemies to become unwilling guardians of their happiness. "I see," I said, because there was nothing else to say. The alternative was a return to the Tower, and whatever else Edmund Ashford might be, he was right about one thing: my education there had been thorough enough. "She is." He paused, as if searching for the right words, spirited. Headstrong, some might say. Her mother died when she was young, and I fear I have indulged her independence more than society would recommend. She requires a firm hand, someone who understands duty and can command respect. There was something in his tone that caught my attention, a note that didn't quite match his earlier satisfaction. For just a moment, he sounded less like a conqueror and more like a father genuinely concerned for his daughter's welfare. The moment passed quickly, but it left me curious despite myself. "When do I begin?" I asked. "Immediately. She is expecting you in the morning room. I should warn you." He hesitated again, and this time his expression was almost apologetic. "She is not aware of your previous circumstances. As far as she knows, you are simply a new addition to the household staff, hired for your experience and discretion. I trust you will maintain that fiction." Of course. It wouldn't do for the daughter to know she was being guarded by the man her father had destroyed. That knowledge might complicate her interactions with me, might even generate sympathy for my situation. Far better to let her treat me as just another servant, another cog in the machinery of her privileged life. "I understand," I said, and I did. The humiliation was to be complete and ongoing, seasoned with the salt of deception. He nodded briskly and turned to go, then paused at the great doors that had once welcomed me home from childhood adventures. "Mr. Whitmore," he said without turning around, "I hope you will find this arrangement enlightening. Sometimes we must lose everything to understand what truly matters." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the courtyard as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming, in more ways than one, and I had no choice but to face it. I looked up at the windows of my family's home, now lit with candles that burned for another man's comfort, and wondered what kind of woman I was about to meet. I had no way of knowing that Miss Lydia Ashford would challenge everything I thought I knew about justice, revenge, and the possibility of redemption. I had no way of knowing that protecting her would become the most dangerous assignment of my life, not because of any external threat, but because of the war she would wage on my carefully guarded heart. The rain began in earnest then, washing the dust of London from my clothes and the taste of captivity from my mouth. Tomorrow, I would meet the daughter of my enemy. Tonight, I would try to remember who I had been before the world taught me that honor was a luxury and love was a weakness I could no longer afford. The morning room was filled with soft golden light when I entered, the kind of warm illumination that transformed even the most mundane space into something almost magical. I had forgotten how beautiful this room could be, with its tall windows facing east toward the rose gardens and its walls lined with books that had been collected by generations of Whitmores. Now they belonged to someone else, like everything else I had once called mine. She was standing with her back to me, silhouetted against the windows, her dark hair caught up in a simple arrangement that suggested she cared little for the elaborate styles favored by most ladies of her station. She wore a morning dress of pale blue muslin that moved gently as she turned pages of what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. There was something in her posture, a quiet confidence that spoke of a woman comfortable in her own skin and unafraid of solitude. When she heard my footsteps on the Persian carpet that had once graced my mother's sitting room, she turned. The first thing that struck me wasn't her beauty, though she was undeniably lovely, with clear gray eyes and features that suggested both intelligence and determination. No, what stopped me cold was the genuine warmth in her smile, the kind of unguarded welcome I hadn't received from another human being in months. "You must be Mr. Whitmore," she said, closing the journal and setting it aside on a table that I recognized as having once belonged to my grandmother. "Father told me you would be joining our household. I confess, I'm rather curious about what qualifies a man to be a personal guard these days." Her voice carried the cultured accent of her class, but there was something beneath it, a hint of mischief that suggested she found the whole concept of needing protection vaguely amusing. She studied me with the kind of direct gaze that would have been considered improper in a more conventional young lady, but there was nothing calculating about it, nothing that suggested she was evaluating my worth or finding me wanting. "Experience, Miss Ashford," I replied carefully, uncertain how much of the truth I could safely reveal. And discretion. She laughed then, a sound that was both musical and entirely unaffected. How wonderfully mysterious. Father does enjoy his secrets, doesn't he? Though I suspect you're far too interesting to be merely another household employee. There was something in the way she said it that made me wonder exactly what Lord Ashford had told her about me, and more importantly, what he hadn't. Her manner suggested genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, but I had learned not to trust first impressions, especially when they were this pleasant. I serve at your father's discretion, miss, I said, falling back on the formal protocols that had been drilled into me during my brief orientation with the household steward. My primary concern is your safety and well-being. My safety, she repeated, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. From what, exactly? The most dangerous thing in Yorkshire is probably Mrs. Pemberton's driving, and she rarely ventures beyond the village church. Despite everything, I found myself fighting back a smile. There was something refreshing about her irreverence, a quality that seemed genuine rather than performed. In my experience, most young ladies of her station were either vapidly agreeable or artificially sophisticated, but Lydia Ashford appeared to be something else entirely. Your father seems to think otherwise, I said, which was both true and safely non-committal. She moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where the last of the autumn roses were still blooming despite the previous night's storm. Father worries about many things. Some of them are even worth worrying about. She glanced back at me with an expression that suggested she might know more about her father's concerns than she was letting on. Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what did you do before you came to guard daughters who don't require guarding? The question was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. I had prepared a story, naturally, but looking at her now, with her honest gray eyes and expectant expression, the lies felt heavier than they should have. I managed estates, I said, which was true enough, though it omitted the rather crucial detail that one of those estates had been my own. I understand land management, accounts, the daily operations required to maintain a household of this size. Ah, she said, nodding as if this explained everything. So you're not really a guard at all. You're more of a, what would one call it? A companion with practical skills? The accuracy of her observation was startling. In truth, that was exactly what I was being asked to be, though the reasons behind it were far more complex than she could imagine. I wondered if her father had planned this, had chosen me specifically because my background would make me a suitable companion for his independent-minded daughter. Something like that, I admitted. She turned back to the window, but not before I caught the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Good. I was beginning to worry that father had hired someone to hover over me like a nursemaid. I'm 23, Mr. Whitmore, not 13. The idea of needing protection from rose thorns and muddy paths seemed rather insulting. 23. Old enough to be married, by society's standards, yet still living in her father's house. I found myself wondering why a woman of her obvious intelligence and considerable beauty had remained unwed. In my experience, fathers of her station were usually eager to arrange advantageous matches for their daughters, especially when those daughters were as clearly spirited as Lydia Ashford appeared to be. What would you like me to call you, Miss Ashford? I asked, realizing that the question of address hadn't been covered in my instructions. Lydia will do perfectly well when we're alone, she said, surprising me again. Miss Ashford when others are present, for propriety's sake. And what shall I call you? Mr. Whitmore seems rather formal for someone who's meant to be my constant companion. Garrett, I said without thinking, then immediately regretted it. The intimacy of first names was dangerous territory, a step toward familiarity that could complicate everything. But it was too late to take it back, and something in her expression told me she had noticed my momentary hesitation. Garrett, she repeated, as if testing how my name sounded in her voice. I like it. It's solid, dependable. The sort of name that belongs to a man who knows how to manage estates and protect silly young women from imaginary dangers. The dangers may not be as imaginary as you think, I said, though I had no idea what those dangers might be. Lord Ashford's concerns had been vague, but there had been something in his manner that suggested genuine worry rather than mere paranoia. She studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing more than I wanted to reveal. "You know something," she said finally. "Something Father told you but didn't tell me." "What is it?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. I had expected to deal with a sheltered young woman who accepted her father's decisions without question, but Lydia Ashford was clearly nothing of the sort. She was sharp, observant, and apparently unafraid to challenge authority when it suited her. "I know that your father loves you and wants to keep you safe," I said carefully. "Beyond that, I follow orders rather than ask questions." She laughed again, but this time there was less humor in it and more frustration. "How diplomatic of you." "Very well, Garrett, keep your secrets for now. But I should warn you that I'm not particularly good at accepting mysteries without eventually solving them." There was something in the way she said it that made me believe her completely. Looking at Lydia Ashford, with her intelligent eyes and stubborn chin, I realized that my assignment was going to be far more complicated than I had anticipated. I had expected to guard a pampered young lady through her daily routine of social calls and needlework. Instead, I was apparently going to be managing a woman who seemed determined to uncover every secret her father and I were trying to keep. What I didn't know, as I stood in that sun-filled morning room making polite conversation with the daughter of my enemy, was that she would indeed solve the mystery. All of them, in fact. And in doing so, she would change everything I thought I knew about justice, loyalty, and the possibility that love might be stronger than revenge. The weeks that followed our first meeting fell into a rhythm that was both comfortable and dangerous. Each morning, I would find Lydia in a different part of the estate, pursuing activities that seemed designed to test the limits of what a proper young lady should do. One day she might be in the stables, discussing bloodlines with the groom in terms that would have impressed a professional horse breeder. The next, she could be found in the estate office, reviewing account books with a comprehension that suggested she understood the financial workings of the property better than many men twice her age. "Do you always involve yourself so thoroughly in estate management?" I asked one particularly crisp October morning, finding her bent over a ledger in what had once been my father's study. The sight of her there, surrounded by the familiar leather-bound volumes and polished wood that held so many of my childhood memories, created an odd ache in my chest that I tried to ignore. She looked up, a streak of ink on her cheek that she seemed completely unaware of. "Father says I have a head for numbers," she replied with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Besides, someone needs to ensure the tenants are being treated fairly. The Ashford holdings have grown considerably in recent years, and growth can sometimes lead to oversight." There was something in the way she said it that caught my attention. The Ashford holdings had indeed grown, largely through the acquisition of my family's lands, but her tone suggested she might know more about the circumstances of that growth than I had assumed. "You disapprove of rapid expansion?" I asked carefully. "I disapprove of expansion that comes at the expense of others' suffering," she said, her gray eyes meeting mine directly. "There are ways to build wealth honorably, and there are ways that leave shadows on a man's conscience. I prefer the former, even if it takes longer." The comment was pointed enough to make me wonder if she suspected something about her father's methods, but before I could probe further, she had returned her attention to the ledgers, effectively ending that line of conversation. It was during our daily rides that I found myself in the most danger, though not from any external threat. Lydia was an accomplished horsewoman, fearless in a way that made my protective instincts clash with my growing admiration for her independence. She would take jumps that made my heart stop, navigate narrow forest paths with casual confidence, and seemed to know every inch of the countryside as if she had been born to it. "You ride like someone who learned young," I observed one afternoon as we walked our horses through a wooded glen that had once been part of my family's hunting grounds. The autumn leaves created a canopy of gold and crimson above us, and the air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter. "Mother taught me," she said, her expression growing soft with memory. She said a woman should never be dependent on others for her freedom to move through the world. Even after she died, I kept writing. It was a way to feel close to her, I suppose. The vulnerability in her voice made something shift in my chest. This was the first time she had mentioned her mother beyond a passing reference, and I found myself wanting to know more about the woman who had raised such an independent daughter. She sounds wise, I said. She was. She was also complicated. She married father for love, you know, which wasn't common in her generation. Her family disapproved quite thoroughly. Lydia glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She used to tell me that sometimes the heart chooses poorly, but that doesn't mean we should stop listening to it entirely. There was something in the way she said it that made me wonder if she was trying to tell me something, but before I could analyze her words too deeply, she had urged her horse into a canter, leaving me to follow. If you're finding this story as intriguing as I hope, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're in. The real danger came not from her physical adventures, but from the quiet moments between them. Evenings when we would sit in the library while she read aloud from books of poetry, her voice giving new life to verses I thought I knew by heart. Afternoons when unexpected rain would trap us in the estate's orangery, surrounded by the exotic scent of citrus trees while we talked about everything from philosophy to politics to the changing nature of English society. She had opinions on subjects that most women of her station were never supposed to consider, and she expressed them with a passion that was both refreshing and dangerous. During one such conversation about land reform and the rights of tenant farmers, I found myself forgetting entirely that she was supposed to be my charge and I her guardian. You speak as if you've given this considerable thought, I said, impressed despite myself by her grasp of complex agricultural economics. I have, she replied simply. When you inherit land, you inherit responsibility for the people who work it. That responsibility doesn't end at the property lines, and it doesn't diminish because you were born to privilege instead of earning it. Her words hit closer to home than she could possibly know. The guilt I carried over my lost tenants, the families who had depended on Whitmore lands for generations and now found themselves answering to a different master, was a constant weight on my conscience. And what of those who lose their land through no fault of their own? I asked, unable to keep the personal pain entirely out of my voice. She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with those perceptive gray eyes. I think, she said carefully, that injustice has a way of revealing itself eventually. The truth may be buried for a time, but it rarely stays hidden forever. The way she looked at me when she said it made my pulse quicken. There was something in her expression that suggested she might know more about my circumstances than she was admitting. But how much could she possibly know? Her father had been adamant that my identity remained secret, and I had been careful to reveal nothing that might give me away. It was during the third week of November, as the first snow began to dust the Yorkshire moors, that everything began to change. I had been accompanying Lydia on her weekly visit to the village, a duty that usually involved nothing more challenging than carrying packages and ensuring her safety during routine social calls. But as we approached the modest cottage where old Mrs. Henley lived alone since her husband's death, Lydia suddenly stopped walking. "Garrett," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tension I had never heard before. "Do you see that man by the churchyard?" I followed her gaze to where a figure in a dark coat stood among the weathered headstones, apparently reading the inscriptions. There was something in his posture that immediately put me on alert, a stillness that suggested he was listening as much as looking. "I see him," I said. "Do you know who he is?" She shook her head, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "He's been asking questions in the village. About father, about our family, about..." She hesitated, then looked directly at me. "About recent changes to the household staff." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Someone was investigating, asking the kinds of questions that could unravel everything. But who? And more importantly, what had they discovered? "We should return to the house," I said, taking her arm gently but firmly. She didn't argue, which told me more about her level of concern than any words could have. As we walked back toward the manor, I found myself scanning the countryside with new eyes, looking for threats that might be closer than I had realized. That evening, as I sat in my small room above the stables, I couldn't shake the feeling that events were beginning to spiral beyond my control. Someone was asking questions about me, about the Ashford household, about circumstances that were supposed to remain buried. And Lydia, with her sharp mind and growing suspicions, was becoming both my greatest comfort and my most dangerous liability. What I didn't know, as I lay awake listening to the wind howl across the moors, was that the man in the churchyard was only the beginning. Forces had been set in motion long before my arrival, and the web of deception surrounding both our families was about to tighten in ways that would test everything I believed about honor, loyalty, and love. The truth came to me in pieces, like shards of broken glass that cut even as they revealed. It began 3 days after we had seen the stranger in the churchyard, when Lydia failed to appear for our morning ride. I found her in her father's study, pale and shaken, holding a letter that trembled in her hands like a captured bird. "Lydia," I said, forgetting protocol in my concern. "What's happened?" She looked up at me with eyes that held a pain I recognized too well. It was the look of someone whose entire world had just shifted beneath their feet, leaving them grasping for solid ground that was no longer there. "Tell me about Lord Whitmore," she said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there while my carefully constructed fiction crumbled around me. She knew. Somehow, she had discovered the truth. "What do you want to know?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I want to know if the charges against him were true," she said, standing and moving to the window where morning light cast her in silhouette. "I want to know if he really stole from the crown, if he really conspired against the realm. And most of all, I want to know why my father has never spoken of him, despite the fact that he now owns everything that once belonged to the Whitmore family." I could lie. I should lie. But looking at her there, holding that letter with hands that shook with emotion, I found that I couldn't add deception to whatever pain she was already carrying. "The charges were false," I said simply. She turned to face me, and in her gray eyes I saw not surprise, but confirmation. "You know this for certain?" "I know it," I said, "because I am Lord Whitmore. Or I was, until your father destroyed everything I had ever known or loved." The silence that followed was deafening. I waited for her to recoil, to call for her father, to react with the horror or disgust that would be natural upon discovering that her trusted guardian was actually her father's greatest enemy. Instead, she simply nodded, as if I had confirmed something she had long suspected. "I thought so," she said softly. "There were too many small things that didn't add up. The way you moved through this house as if you knew every stone. The way your face changed when you looked at certain rooms. The way you spoke about estate management with the authority of ownership rather than employment." She set the letter down on the desk and walked toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. "This letter is from a solicitor in London. He has evidence, he claims, that the accusations against you were fabricated. Evidence that someone deliberately planted documents to make you appear guilty of crimes you never committed." My heart stopped. Evidence. After all these months of hopeless captivity, someone had found proof of what I had always known but could never demonstrate. What kind of evidence? I asked, hardly daring to hope. Financial records showing payments to forgers. Testimony from a clerk who was paid to place false documents in your private papers. And most damaging of all, correspondence proving that someone very close to our family orchestrated the entire scheme. The world tilted around me. Not just evidence of my innocence, but proof of conspiracy. Proof that someone had deliberately destroyed my life, my family's honor, everything I had ever valued. Who? I asked, though part of me already feared the answer. Lydia's face was pale but determined. My father's younger brother. Marcus Ashford. Apparently, he has been embezzling from the family holdings for years, and when he realized discovery was inevitable, he needed a scapegoat. Someone whose ruin would be so complete, so public, that no one would look too closely at the circumstances surrounding it. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. Not Edmund Ashford, the man I had spent months hating, planning revenge against, blaming for every moment of suffering I had endured. His brother. A man I had barely known existed, operating in shadow while Edmund unknowingly benefited from his crimes. "Does your father know?" I asked. "Not yet," she said, moving closer until she stood directly in front of me. "The solicitor sent the letter to me because he couldn't be sure who in the Ashford family could be trusted. He had heard rumors that I was principled. That I might be willing to listen to evidence regardless of its implications for my own family." I stared at her, this remarkable woman who had just learned that her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies and betrayal, yet stood there calmly discussing the best way to pursue justice. Most people in her position would have been concerned primarily with protecting their family's reputation, finding ways to bury the truth to avoid scandal. "What will you do?" I asked. "What I have to do," she said simply. "Tell father everything. Help restore your title and lands. Make whatever amends are possible for the injustice you've suffered." She paused, her eyes searching my face. "The question is, what will you do?" It was the question I had been avoiding since the moment she spoke my real name. For months, I had sustained myself on dreams of revenge, fantasies of seeing Edmund Ashford destroyed as thoroughly as he had destroyed me. Now I learned that he was as much a victim as I was, manipulated by his own brother into unwitting complicity in my ruin. "I don't know," I admitted. She stepped even closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes, could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. "I know what you've been planning," she said softly. "I've seen it in your face sometimes, when you thought no one was looking. The anger, the desire for vengeance. You've been thinking about ways to hurt my father the way he hurt you." She was right, and there was no point in denying it. But standing there, looking into her face, I found that the burning rage that had sustained me through the darkest moments of my imprisonment was fading, replaced by something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. "And now?" she asked. "Now I find myself thinking that revenge might not be as satisfying as I once believed," I said honestly. She smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from her since she had discovered the truth. "Good," she said. "Because there's something else I need to tell you. Something the solicitor discovered that makes this situation even more complicated than it already appears." My heart, which had just begun to settle into a more normal rhythm, sped up again. "What?" "Marcus Ashford is missing. He disappeared from London 3 weeks ago, taking with him a considerable sum of money and leaving behind debts that could destroy the family." "The man we saw in the churchyard?" "He wasn't investigating you, Garrett. He was looking for Marcus. And I'm beginning to suspect that Marcus knows his crimes have been discovered." The implications hit me like a cold wave. If Marcus Ashford knew the truth was coming out, if he was desperate enough to flee London with stolen money, then he was also desperate enough to do whatever was necessary to prevent that truth from reaching the right people. Including, quite possibly, eliminating the witnesses who could testify against him. "We're in danger," I said, the realization crystallizing with horrible clarity. "Yes," she said calmly. "We are. Which is why I need you to answer one more question, and I need you to answer it honestly." "What?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for whatever response I might give. "Despite everything that's happened, despite the deception and the circumstances that brought you here, despite the fact that loving me would be the most complicated thing you could possibly do, is there any chance that you could care for me the way I've come to care for you? If this story has you on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion." The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. Looking at her, this remarkable woman who had just risked everything to uncover the truth, who stood ready to fight for justice even when it meant destroying her own family's carefully constructed life, I realized that somewhere along the way my mission of revenge had become something else entirely. "Lydia," I said, reaching out to touch her face with trembling fingers, "caring for you stopped being a choice weeks ago. The real question is whether two people with our histories can build something real together, or whether we're both too damaged by what we've lost to risk loving again." She leaned into my touch, her eyes closing for just a moment before opening again with fierce determination. "There's only one way to find out," she said. "But first, we need to survive whatever Marcus has planned. And something tells me that's going to be more difficult than either of us imagines." We didn't have to wait long to discover what Marcus Ashford had planned. That very evening, as snow began to fall in earnest across the Yorkshire countryside, he came for us. I was in the stables checking on the horses when I heard the commotion from the main house. Shouts, the sound of something heavy falling, then an ominous silence that made my blood run cold. I ran toward the manor, my heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with my own safety and everything to do with the woman I had just admitted I loved. I found Lord Edmund in the main hall, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his face pale with shock and rage. 2 footmen lay unconscious near the door, and the usually pristine entrance was in complete disarray. "Where is she?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer from the devastation written across his face. "He took her," Edmund said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Marcus. He had men with him, professionals by the look of them. They knew exactly where to find her, exactly how to get in without raising an alarm until it was too late." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the man who had spent months plotting revenge against Edmund Ashford, now desperate to save his daughter from the real villain who had destroyed us both. But there was no time for philosophical reflection. Every moment we wasted was another moment Lydia was in the hands of a desperate man who had already proven he would destroy lives to protect his secrets. "Did he say where he was taking her?" I asked. Edmund nodded grimly. "The old Whitmore hunting lodge in Skeldale. He said if I wanted to see her alive again, would come alone with proof that all evidence against him had been destroyed. He gave me until dawn." The hunting lodge. I knew it well, had spent countless childhood summers there with my father and brothers. It was remote, defensible, and far enough from the main roads that screams wouldn't carry to anyone who might help. If Marcus had chosen it as his stronghold, he had chosen well. "He's not going to let her go," I said, voicing what we both knew. "Even if you destroy the evidence, even if you give him everything he asks for. She's seen too much, knows too much. The only way he can be truly safe is if both she and the evidence disappear permanently." Edmund's face crumbled. For the first time since I had known him, the composed aristocrat vanished, replaced by a father terrified for his child's life. "Then what do we do?" he asked. "I can't lose her, Garrett. She's all I have left." The use of my first name, the raw emotion in his voice, the way he looked at me not as a former enemy but as perhaps the only person who could help him save what mattered most, broke down the last of my resistance to working with him. Whatever had passed between us, whatever wrongs had been committed, none of it mattered now compared to Lydia's safety. "We don't give him what he wants," I said. "We give him what he deserves." The next few hours were a blur of desperate preparation. I knew the hunting lodge better than Marcus possibly could, knew its weaknesses and blind spots, knew how to approach it without being seen. Edmund, despite his fear, proved to have resources I hadn't expected. He produced weapons, horses, even a few loyal men who were willing to risk their lives for their master's daughter. But as we prepared to ride out into the snowstorm, I realized that all the planning in the world might not be enough. Marcus was desperate, cornered, and holding the woman I loved as his final card. Men in his position were capable of anything. "Edmund," I said as we mounted our horses in the stable yard, snow swirling around us in the pre-dawn darkness. "Whatever happens tonight, you need to know that I never intended for any of this to touch her. When I came here, I thought you were my enemy. I was wrong. He looked at me through the falling snow, his face grave but no longer hostile. I know, he said simply. And you need to know that if I had realized what Marcus was doing, if I had known the cost of my family's advancement, I would never have accepted a single acre of Whitmore land. Your father was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to his legacy. It wasn't absolution, exactly, but it was understanding. And in that moment, it was enough. The ride to Skeldale took us through some of the most treacherous terrain in Yorkshire, made worse by the blizzard that seemed determined to bury the entire county under a blanket of white. But the storm that made our journey difficult would also provide cover for our approach, and I found myself grateful for the harsh weather that had once seemed like another obstacle to overcome. We reached the hunting lodge just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the snow clouds. The building sat in a small valley, surrounded by bare trees that offered little concealment but excellent sight lines for anyone watching from within. Smoke rose from the chimney, and I could see the warm glow of firelight in the windows. It looked almost welcoming, if you didn't know that inside, a desperate man was holding an innocent woman hostage. I left Edmund and his men positioned around the perimeter and approached the lodge alone, as we had planned. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing Marcus Ashford for the first time in my life. He was a smaller man than his brother, with thinning hair and the soft look of someone who had lived comfortably on other people's money. But his eyes held a wildness that spoke of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Lord Whitmore," he said with mock courtesy. "How good of you to join us. I was beginning to think you didn't care about my dear niece's welfare." "Where is she?" I demanded. "Safe, for now. Though I'm afraid her continued safety depends entirely on your cooperation." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Please, come in. We have so much to discuss." I found Lydia in the main room, tied to a chair near the fireplace but apparently unharmed. Her gray eyes met mine as I entered, and I saw not fear but determination. Even as a prisoner, she radiated the strength that had made me fall in love with her. "Garrett," she said, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "I'm sorry. I should have been more careful." "This isn't your fault," I said, meaning every word. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "How touching. The disgraced lord and the merchant's daughter, star-crossed lovers brought together by my brother's misguided guilt. It's almost poetic." "Let her go," I said. "Your quarrel is with me, not her." "My quarrel, dear Garrett, is with anyone who threatens to expose the truth. And unfortunately, sweet Lydia here has seen far too much evidence for my comfort." He moved to stand behind her chair, and I saw her jaw tighten with suppressed anger. "But I'm not unreasonable. I'm willing to make a trade." "What kind of trade?" He smiled, and it was one of the most unpleasant expressions I had ever seen. "Your life for hers. You confess publicly to the crimes you were originally accused of, take full responsibility for the missing money, and exonerate both me and my brother of any wrongdoing. In exchange, Lydia walks away from this alive and unharmed." The offer was exactly what I had expected, and exactly what I couldn't accept. Not because I wasn't willing to die for her, but because I knew Marcus well enough now to realize he would never let either of us leave this lodge alive. He had gone too far, risked too much, to be satisfied with anything less than permanent silence. "And if I refuse?" I asked. His hand moved to rest on Lydia's shoulder, and she flinched away from his touch. "Then I'm afraid this charming reunion will end very badly indeed." What happened next unfolded with the swift brutality of a winter storm. Edmund's men, positioned as we had planned, struck simultaneously from multiple directions. Windows shattered as they burst through, while Edmund himself came through the kitchen entrance. Marcus, caught completely off guard, reached for a pistol but found himself facing 3 armed men before he could draw it. The fight was brief but vicious. Marcus, realizing his situation was hopeless, made one final desperate attempt to use Lydia as a human shield. But he had underestimated her entirely. The moment his attention shifted to the attacking men, she managed to free one hand from her bonds and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with enough force to double him over. I was on him before he could recover, months of rage and frustration finally finding their proper target. But even as I held him pinned to the floor, even as I had the power to take the revenge I had dreamed of for so long, I found that I had no desire for it. Looking at this pathetic, desperate man who had destroyed so many lives out of greed and cowardice, I felt not satisfaction but pity. "It's over," I said simply. The rest came together with surprising swiftness. The evidence the solicitor had gathered was more than sufficient to clear my name completely and restore my title and lands. Marcus, faced with overwhelming proof of his crimes, confessed to everything in exchange for transportation to the colonies rather than hanging. The money he had stolen was recovered, the debts he had created were settled, and the Ashford family name, while damaged, survived. But the real transformation came in the weeks that followed, as Edmund and I worked together to repair not just the financial damage Marcus had caused, but the deeper wounds his deceptions had created. It turned out that many of the improvements made to what had been Whitmore lands were Edmund's own innovations, paid for with his own money, implemented because he genuinely cared about the welfare of the tenants and the productivity of the estate. "I want you to have it back," he told me one afternoon as we stood in what had once been my father's study. "All of it. The title, the lands, everything that was taken from you." I looked around the room that had been restored to exactly the way I remembered it from my childhood, then at the man who had unknowingly benefited from my family's destruction. "Keep half," I said finally. "You've earned it through your stewardship. Besides, I suspect we're going to be family soon, and family shares." His smile was the first truly relaxed expression I had ever seen on his face. "I was hoping you'd say that. She's been insufferable since you proposed, you know. Entirely too happy for a proper English lady." The wedding took place in spring, in the same chapel where my parents had been married, with Yorkshire sunshine streaming through stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns on ancient stones. Lydia wore her mother's dress and carried roses from the garden she had helped restore, and when she walked down the aisle toward me, I realized that every moment of suffering, every dark night of despair, every lost hope had been worth it to arrive at this moment. As I watched her approach, beautiful and radiant in mine, I understood something that no amount of education or experience had been able to teach me. True nobility wasn't about titles or land or birth. It was about the choices we made when everything we valued was at stake. It was about choosing love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. And sometimes, if we were very fortunate, it was about finding someone whose heart was noble enough to choose us in return. If you've enjoyed this story of love conquering injustice, and you believe that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well and loving deeply, then subscribe to hear more tales of the human heart's remarkable capacity for redemption. Because in the end, that's what makes us truly noble, not the titles we inherit, but the love we choose to give.